Hi there, everyone. I'm happy to be here for taking your questions in the next hour or so on Facebook Live. Anything you've got, I just wanted to underscore that today we, of course, went into stage two of Alberta's Open for Summer plan. Right off the top, some people, last time I did a Facebook Live, somebody asked if it was just open for summer or whether we'd also be open for fall. So, and I can understand that question given how so much uncertainty we've had in the past 16 tough months. Very simple answer is this is open for good. It is based on the phase two we got to today was based on getting to 60% of the eligible population, that's everyone 12 and above, having had at least one dose of vaccine 2 weeks ago, because it takes a couple weeks for these vaccines to fully kick in. And that's why we were able to move to a very significant series of reopenings, of relaxations of public health measures today. And I'll just share some of those with you. We've gone up to 20 people for outdoor social gatherings, 20 people for wedding ceremonies. Restaurants are open for 6 people, both indoors and outside on patios. And that is no longer limited to your household group. You can now go out with friends to restaurants. Retail capacity increases to 1/3 of occupancy. Places of worship, welcome to have 1/3 of their fire code capacity for congregational worship during this period. And very happy about that. Gyms open for solo, drop-in, and group classes. Indoor settings that are allowed to open for up to 1/3 capacity today include rec centers, theaters, arenas, museums, art galleries, libraries, and others. Indoor and outdoor youth and adult sports resume. Youth activities like day camps and play centers. Personal wellness services can go back to walk-in and not just appointment services. And a bunch of other, we can have outdoor events like concerts for up to 150 people. So a very big step forward. I just want to say thank you to everyone who got the jab, who got vaccinated. That allowed us to get to this point. And now, the good news is we're closing in on that next and final threshold of a 70% vaccination for first dose for the eligible population. As of, I just got off a briefing call a minute ago, and we were at 67.8% of population with 16.8% who have had a second dose. So we're making good progress. I also just got briefed minutes ago from the Deputy Minister of Health that we're expecting, we've confirmed an incoming shipment of 800,000 Moderna vaccine doses in the next week or so. So we're going to have plenty of supply, which is why this afternoon I announced that we are speeding up bookings for second doses to include anybody who got vaccinated with their first dose back in April. That includes me. So a lot of us who were in our kind of 40s, 50s were the April folks for first dose. And you can mix and match. So if you got a AstraZeneca in April or whenever, you can ask for an mRNA vaccine, which would be like the Moderna and or Pfizer. So I happen to sign up, I believe, for Pfizer, and I'm getting that next 8 days from now, Friday next week. Anyway, those are some good news points, but we just want to urge people, we need to get about another roughly 100,000 people vaccinated to be able to move forward fully to the full reopening. And now when that happens is up to you guys, it's up to Albertans getting in line. We've got walk-in clinics, super convenient, all across the province right now. We ramped those up with things like the driving clinic in Calgary on the weekends as well. So please, if you haven't gotten your first dose yet, please go and get it so you can bring us closer to the full and permanent reopening so that we can put this terrible time behind us. Well, for once and for all. With that, I will switch over to your questions. Catherine Filipowski, what happens if we don't reach 70%? Well, Catherine, first of all, we are so close. Like I say, we're about 100,000 people from there. We're 2.2% from there. Actually, I think we're now closer to, we need 80,000 because I just got an increase, a 0.5% increase in the last few hours in my latest briefing. So we need about 80,000 people. We'll get there. We'll get there. It's just a question of when. And as Dr. Hinshaw said today in our briefing, I mean, if some bizarre thing happens and all of a sudden we stop at 69.9%, she can look at she and her team can take into account the growing second dose coverage in their overall estimate of population protection. And that's kind of been their plan B. But we're not going to need to go there. It's only a question of how quick we get her done. And by the way, if you have or you know of anybody like a snowbird who was vaccinated outside the country, let's say they were on holidays down south or something, they can help us out. They can go and drop off the paperwork to confirm their vaccine at any AHS clinic or office, and we'll put that data in our system. They count towards it. We also just got data from the Federal Department of Defense on the several thousand military personnel in Alberta who had been vaccinated but had not been in the Alberta system. So we're starting to catch up. Karen Campbell McKeel says, do COVID survivors need both COVID vaccine doses? Yes, Karen. It's true that people who had a COVID infection have a degree of immunity. What we don't know for sure yet is how much immunity and for how long. And whether, let's say you contracted what's called the wild variant, or the wild strain, which was the main COVID-19 virus for most of the past 16 months. If you contracted that, you have a certain natural immunity on that strain, but you may not be immune to reinfection from for example, the so-called P1 or Brazilian or the B1617 or Indian variant. So natural immunity from one strain doesn't guarantee you immunity from a new or different strain. So it would be really helpful for your own health if you also got vaccinated first and second dose. And the second dose really, I mean, it just brings us up to that higher level of protection. Generally speaking, the first dose is good to protect you in about 80% of people who have the first dose are protected from any serious symptoms from COVID. But once you get that second dose, you're up into like the 97, 98% range. So it's that extra margin of protection. All right, Mildred Feather says, when are people that were vaccinated in May going to be able to book second doses? Well, right now the date is June 25th, Mildred, but with the big supply dump that we're getting out of Moderna this coming week and continued reliable Pfizer supply, I think we might be able to move that date up. So just stay tuned. Right now, as of today, if you were vaccinated in April, first dose, you are eligible to book your second dose. Please, you can go online right now. Could I please ask our team to put a link below to the AHS vaccine booking website? Of course, you can also go to of 1,350 pharmacies across the province that are offering vaccines. If you don't know one in your neighborhood, please go to the Alberta Blue Cross website, and let's also add the link on that below. I was vaccinated, I think it was like late April, if I'm not mistaken, sort of April 20th, give or take. And I went online today and we got my second dose booked Friday next week, so 8 days from now. So the system is working well. Guy J. Fortier says, why are we not investing in hydrogen? Oh, we are in a big way, Guy, in a very big way. Maybe you missed the announcement yesterday, but the world's largest hydrogen producer, a global company called Air Products, joined me at a historic press conference to announce that they are building a huge new hydrogen processing facility just east of Edmonton, $1.3 billion capital expenditure. The global CEO, Mr. Seifi Ghanem, said that they're looking maybe to triple the size of that once it's done. It will be feeding hydrogen for use in the oil sands. And that was partly because of our hydrogen strategy as a government. It was partly a $15 million support from Emissions Reduction Alberta, which is funded by the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Fund. That's our levy on major greenhouse gas emitters. And they're also likely to qualify for a support probably in the $80 million range through our petrochemical diversification incentive program. And of course, they're also coming just because of the good general economic conditions that we've created with the job creation tax cut, red tape reduction, local property tax incentives, pre-approved industrial zones, and our open for business attitude. So Mr. Ganem, the CEO of Air Products, said yesterday, and I think we put up a video on this, he said that the reason they chose Alberta was because, and I'm sorry, I'm going to toot my horn here, he said because, quotes, Premier Kenney and his staff have been so aggressive in bringing us to Alberta. That's why we chose this province. That is our hydrogen strategy at work. And you'll be pleased to know, Guy, that this is just the beginning. We are in talks with multiple major companies. I mean, just 2 weeks back, ATCO and Suncor announced a joint venture, their intention to make major investments in the production of blue hydrogen. A lot of this, it all is connected to Alberta's leadership on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. With that, we've been doing that for 15 years, the Shell Quest project, but the recent commissioning of the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, again, all of this supported by TIER. And the hydrogen industry, for them to produce low or zero carbon hydrogen, they require carbon sequestration and storage. So this is part of our broader strategy. So Guy, we're very excited about this hydrogen. There are some estimates that it could become like a multi-trillion-dollar industry in the years to come. And I truly believe we are set up to be a global leader in that. It's very exciting because it means increased domestic demand for our natural gas feedstock, which is good for all the folks who work in oil and gas in terms of drilling, exploration, service industry, workers, companies. So it means higher prices locally for our gas. It means reducing the carbon emissions of our whole provincial economy and the oil sands producers, so they get easier access to capital. It also means an export industry on a clean energy product. It means a lot of construction jobs. It means a lot of high tech. It's a win-win-win-win. So just stay tuned, Guy, for the publication of our final hydrogen strategy. Associate Minister Dale Donnelly is working on that. Laura Tillich says, when do you think masks can be finished? Laura, the answer is when we go to phase 3, which right now will be around the end of June, beginning of July. It depends on how many people get vaccinated in the next week, 10 days. But right now, today, we should be opening, I don't know, July 2nd or 3rd based on our current pace of vaccination. I hope it goes faster. But then the provincial mask mandates are gone. And so I hear some noise from some municipal politicians. They want to have one. That's not the science. That's not the position of the chief medical officer or Alberta's public health experts. And so I would fully expect local voters to ask their municipal leaders to respect the science and the authority of the chief medical officer and people's freedom. Once we get to 70% population protection, we will be higher in terms of population protection at that point than any other place in the world that has opened up and lifted their restrictions. And in those jurisdictions, what have we seen? COVID continued to decline dramatically. Texas eliminated all restrictions on March 6th at only 15% first dose coverage in their eligible population. Now, it is true, they had like 35% with the population with natural immunity, but you combine those numbers, they were below 50% total population protection. We'll be above 70% and climbing. Their COVID numbers have crashed through the floor. Ours are going down very fast. And so we truly believe this is a safe plan and that the vaccines replace public health restrictions. The vaccines replace masks, as, to use a technical term, the public health intervention. The vaccines work. Let's embrace the science and give people the incentive, the positive that comes from the decision of enough people to get vaccinated. Ashley Wigton says, open for summer, open for only summer. Why these words? Why not just open? Good point, Ashley. I addressed that right off the top. I said it's actually open for good. And maybe we should change the tagline. I guess what we were trying to convey was our hope and expectation that we actually would be open for this summer. Summer technically begins on June 21st. We're not quite going to make it there, but we will be open in July. And that we just wanted to give people that sense that it's imminent, that the waiting, the delays, the grind, it's so close to being over. But you're absolutely right. It's open for good. And you just gave me a good marketing idea, Ashley. And I'll just say this to my team here. When we do the big event to celebrate our full opening, we'll change the slogan to open for summer, open for good. And that is true. Look, on that point, Ashley, COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, will continue to exist. It will continue to circulate, much like the flu does. And it will mutate and will take different forms. And it will continue for some people to pose a health threat. Some people will get sick. And some people will pass away. Just like in a typical year, we have, I think on average, about 70 influenza deaths. Just like the Spanish influenza, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920, continued to kind of cycle through the population of the world until the 1950s. So COVID doesn't disappear, but what happens is with effective vaccines, and we start at 70% at phase 3, but that number will continue to grow as we get fully second dosed and more people get first dose. And with all of that, we get to what the epidemiologists call herd immunity, community immunity, population protection. And that means that the virus has a really hard time transmitting when 8 out of every 10 people that the virus encounters can't effectively get infected. And if they do get infected, they're almost, in no case are they going to end up in hospital. So it no longer presents a large-scale threat to human life. Yes, a small-scale threat like so many other diseases, but it no longer presents a threat to the healthcare system. So I can't understand these politicians and media commentators and others who seem so attached to restrictions without fully appreciating the negative health consequences that they have. We are fortunate to have in Dr. Adina Hinshaw, somebody who is, I think, a chief medical officer who does understand that balance, who has said repeatedly there are negative health consequences to restrictions, and that's why Alberta is moving forward with confidence as the fastest province fully to lift restrictions. Holly DeSimon says, sorry folks, I have a bit of spring allergies, will you have vaccine incentives for Albertans getting the vaccination like Manitoba? Holly, the answer is we're working on that. I just got off a call about exactly that issue. Stay tuned. The state of Ohio, my friend Governor Mike DeWine, was the first state in the U.S. to go with a vaccine lottery to get the numbers up. And at first they were kind of ridiculed, but guess what? They had a huge uptick in vaccinations. And if we were to do a lottery just to get an extra 1 or 2 percentage points, it would easily pay for itself in terms of saving future health costs. I think I was briefed this evening that every COVID patient costs us an average of like $230,000. So if we just prevent a handful of people from going into hospital with something like a lottery and incentive, it would pay for itself multiple times over in terms of preventing hospitalizations, not to mention avoiding deaths. And so just stay tuned. We're working on that idea. Christoph Ulch says, let's talk about the 1.3 billion. Yeah, that's great, Chris. I think Christoph is talking about yesterday's announcement by Air Products to invest $1.3 billion in the Alberta economy with their new hydrogen processing facility just east of Edmonton. It's going to create 2,600 good-paying construction jobs and then dozens of permanent operating jobs. It will help to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the oil sands, which helps those companies in ensuring their future, getting access to capital. But as the president of Air Products said yesterday at our news conference, they will likely triple or maybe quadruple their plant out there. That would be like maybe an $8 billion capital investment. So much more of that to come. Hydrogen, very exciting. All right. Next question. Jonathan Monroe, will those who are not vaccinated be able to travel without issues? Well, let me answer it this way. In terms of Alberta, Jonathan, we will be lifting our advisories against both domestic and international travel when we go to phase 3, about 3 weeks from now. But we don't control the border policies of foreign countries. So I think the answer is it depends on where you're going. It depends on what their policies are. What I hear and expect is that Europe, for example, and certainly Asian countries, will relax their quarantine and requirements and lift travel restrictions for people entering those countries who can prove that they have been fully vaccinated. So I think that the answer to your question is probably, in many cases, that yes, people will need to be vaccinated to travel to many foreign countries, but it will be up to each country to decide. Jax Dexter says, if cases go back up with hospitalizations, will we go back to having restrictions? Jax, the answer is that I cannot see that scenario happening. We just have to get through the next 3 weeks here to continue to see that the numbers come down or stabilize. But once we get to phase 3 and lift all restrictions, we're in a world where we have 70% plus population protection. There is no precedent in the world on COVID where a country with anything remotely close to that level of vaccine and protection and immunity has seen a surge in hospitalizations. The one country that we're following as a interesting reference point is Britain, the United Kingdom, because they're very far ahead on the vaccine program. Although Alberta is now ahead of them on first doses. We're at 68% on first doses. Britain is at like 62% on first doses. That's because they went further on the second dose and they didn't give the first doses to their younger people. But as a result of that decision, they've had this so-called Indian or Delta variant, the B1617.2 variant, circulating in younger populations, teenagers and 20-somethings, who did not get vaccinated because of their approach, primarily in a handful of northern English cities. And there is the data is conflicting. There's some data to suggest that the vaccines are much less effective on first dose against this Indian B1617 variant. So everybody's watching that super close to see, well, will this spike in new cases result in a spike in the British hospitals? And so far, the answer is no, it's not. It's cases running amongst younger, healthier people, much less prone to get hospitalized. So I'm sorry, you wanted just a very simple answer. I believe the answer is no, there will be no need for additional restrictions because, at least in the world of COVID-19 as we know it, there are no known variants which defeat the vaccines. And so once you get to that level, 70 to 80% population protection, the hospitalization numbers from everything we've seen, Israel, Britain, US, et cetera, the only exception has been a couple of countries that went strong on the Chinese vaccine, which it just apparently is less effective. So, Jonathan, in the real world, the answer is no. Clint Cardinal says, why are you wasting time and money on a referendum on equalization payments instead of a more effective one on separation? Well, Clint, because we're keeping our word to you and Alberta voters. We committed to do this in the last election, and it's not a waste of time or money. We want to give Albertans to speak out on the unfairness that Alberta has faced for so long in the Federation. Our message is, we are, as Albertans, I think most of us are proud to have been able to share some of our good fortune with the rest of the country when times were good here but bad elsewhere. But what we can't tolerate is having to pay massively to subsidize the rest of the Federation through our federal taxes, while other governments block and impair our resource development, hurt our economy, our ability to pay the bills to generate that wealth. So that's really what this referendum is about. The referendum itself will not change equalization. It won't amend the Constitution. It gives us, though, a negotiating mandate to go to Ottawa and demand reform. And I think that leads us up to other things, potentially on our own police, on our own pensions, and other ways of asserting our autonomy. It's part of a longer-term strategy. But Clint, we were elected as a party that supports a strong Alberta within a united Canada. And about 85% of Albertans believe that. Clint, if you're a separatist and you wanted a referendum on it, all it would do, with respect, is prove that there is no real threat for separation. I don't think making threats you cannot keep are not a good negotiating strategy. So I think that would actually weaken rather than strengthen Alberta's hand in demanding fairness. All right, Cheryl McKay says, Mr. Kenney, you have done a wonderful job. Thank you. It hasn't been easy. No, it has not, Cheryl. Please hang in there and keep doing the great job. Thank you very much. I'll take any kudos we can get. It has been super tough for everybody. And I just want everyone to know that, we've had to make some brutally painful decisions that none of us wanted to make, but we felt were necessary to save many lives, to prevent a disaster in the healthcare system. But we've also been criticized for being too reluctant to bring in public health restrictions. And to those folks, I say that the consequences of many of those restrictions have also been devastating on people's lives. This hasn't been easy for any government, for any province, territory, country, but thank God we are finally at the end of this. Tam No says, hello, Mr. Kenney. With the oil now back to $70, and sooner or later we'll face the limited pipe. Oh, do you think sooner or later we'll face limited pipeline capacity problem again, like 2 years ago? Thank you. Great question, Tam. Yeah. Sooner or later, we will face that limited pipeline capacity if we don't get more pipelines built. But there's good news, Tam. We think just a few months away from Enbridge completing their Line 3 replacement program, which will add about 380,000 barrels a day of takeaway capacity, of shipment capacity. And that will give us the flex capacity that we need for the next couple of years. Secondly, we, at the current price point of $70 WTI, which is projected by most in the third quarter of this year to go to $80 WTI, at that price point, crude by rail economics become a lot more attractive. And investments in what is called diluent reduction technology will further improve crude by rail economics. Gibson Energy will be opening its 50,000 barrel a day diluent reduction unit near Hardisty this summer, which basically takes a bunch of the, obviously the diluent out of the bitumen mix, the dilbit. And dilbit is diluent plus bitumen. So it extracts a lot of the kind of liquid that's infused to help move bitumen down the pipelines. And so doing, they can pack more onto the train cars, ship more at a lower unit cost. So what I'm trying to say is we should also be seeing increases, fairly significant increases in crude by rail, and that is economical. And of course, the Trans Mountain expansion is critical. The project is on schedule, and it represents about 500,000 additional barrels per day, most importantly, to a coastline to increase the price. So, Tam, I would say that the midterm prognosis is quite good for having adequate shipment capacity. And that's a very good thing because we are now producing. This is something you won't hear all of these Green Left and people attacking Alberta. They won't celebrate or admit this, but Alberta is producing and exporting more oil today than we ever have in our history. So last month, I think we were at 3.9 million barrels per day, which is a historic high. And the oil sands companies, they can increase production based on their current projects. I don't know, probably by a couple 100,000. And we will certainly see an increased investment in the conventional basin at these prices. So I think that that next year, as we come out of COVID, global economy and demand recovers, prices apparently will stay strong. I think there's a very good chance that we'll be producing and shipping over 4 million barrels a day out of Alberta. And at that point, we will have adequate capacity. What we really want is for some of these companies to be able to take the next step, make some significant investments in expanding or building new greenfield developments, and all the capital investment that goes with that. That's big jobs, big opportunity. So for that to happen, for the oil sands to take that next step to ensure that they can continue well into the future, will require expanded pipeline capacity. Doug Brinkman, well, hi Doug, good to see you. Hello Premier, how soon can we expect recall to pass third reading, and what happened to Speaker Nathan Cooley's ruling on point of privilege? Doug, I don't know which ruling you're talking about, because there are points of privilege in the ledge almost every day. And I must confess, I'm not in there all the time, so I can't answer that one. The other question was, could you bring that back? Doug's question? Recall, recall, past third reading. Next week. So I believe Citizens Initiative, we voted third reading on that last night, and recall will be passed at third reading in the ledge next week, our last week of the spring setting. And then we anticipate the Lieutenant Governor will give that royal assent to become law later next week. Leanne Kalin says, you brought in the equalization. You didn't think it wasn't fair then. Why a change of attitude? Actually, Leanne, I know the NDP says that I brought in equalization. Equalization was actually brought in, I think, in 1957. I was born in 1968. So I assure you, I didn't bring in equalization 10 years before I was born. And nor did I bring in equalization when I was a minister of Stephen Harper's cabinet. By then, the program had existed for 40-some years. The equalization reform formula is tweaked, modified from time to time. And that happened while I was the Minister of Immigration, Minister of Employment, who doesn't have anything to do with equalization. That's the responsibility of the Minister of Finance. And it is, but it's the Harper government actually did reform equalization. It didn't go as far as as Alberta would like right now. But I'll tell you this, first of all, the Alberta government never asked for fundamental equalization reform. The then Stelmach government said it was happy that we had changed other transfers. The Harper government went to full, equal per capita transfers for the Canada Social Transfer and the Canada Health Transfer. Together, those things were worth about an additional $1.5 billion a year to Alberta. So we did reform federal transfers to make them a lot fairer for Alberta. We also slowed the rate of growth in equalization payments for have-not provinces, which reduced Quebec's equalization entitlement. And you might recall Premier Danny Williams of Newfoundland about, circa 2007, was in quite a terror because of our equalization reform. So we did make reforms. We went further than actually the government of Alberta was asking for at the time, but things have changed totally as well. At that time, Alberta's economy was booming. Other provinces were doing much less well economically and fiscally. And we had governments across the country that were facilitating, helping us build energy infrastructure, supporting oil and gas. And really what's changed so dramatically is that starting about 2015, we went into a big economic trough, led the country in unemployment, huge deficit, but we're still funding through our federal taxes, $21 billion a year on average, in net transfers to other parts of the country, about $3 billion of which is out of the equalization envelope. And then that meant we were subsidizing public services in other provinces, like BC that tried to stop TMX, Quebec that tried to stop Energy East, and Ottawa under the Trudeau government with anti-energy policies. So we were being told to keep paying the bills by governments benefiting from our wealth that were restricting our ability to generate the wealth that pays the bill. So that's a fundamental difference that's changed over the past 10, 15, and 20 years. So we should change our tactics and our approach when the circumstances change so dramatically. I think most Albertans kind of get that intuitively. All right, Jolene Lutic says, spring allergies here. Please address how the government plans to manage the debt incurred through COVID and all other debts. What's your plan, Mr. Kenney? Thank you, Jolene. I honestly wish we had more questions like that, because they're, Albertans seem less focused on the need for fiscal sustainability than we were in the past. The answer is, look, Jolene, first of all, please understand that we were elected as a government on a plan to balance the budget, about an $8 billion deficit that we inherited from the NDP, but to do it gently, gradually over 4 years. And the plan was a modest reduction in overall spending at 2.8% reduction. And we were well on track for that. Then we got sideswiped by COVID and an economic and energy price collapse all at once, 3 black swan events. And we just got absolutely whacked last year. There's no other way of putting it. Like, our energy revenues went to virtually zero. We used to bring in, I think, if I'm not mistaken, $5 billion a year in oil sands royalties alone. And last year that went to like 100 million, just to put that in context. We used to bring in, back a decade ago, 10 billion in energy royalties. Last year, like, it was 200 million. So it was a total revenue collapse, plus huge expenditures for healthcare, other support for people coping with COVID. And so we ended up booking around a $20 billion deficit for the COVID year. And now the good news, so Jolene, how are we going to get out of this? Well, the truth is we're not going to get out of it in the next 2 years. It's just about virtually impossible to do that without incredibly deep and painful cuts, which I don't think Albertans would support right now. So the key thing, Jolene, the key strategy is economic growth, jobs and growth, growing the economy, getting more people back to work, and more people back to full-time work and better paying jobs, grows the tax base, increases our revenues. That's the best way to reduce the deficit. So that plus continued spending restraint. Now, I didn't say big cuts, but just better managing spending. And, we get criticized for that, but money doesn't grow on trees. We're definitely not, as a government, going to raise taxes like the NDP would in order to deal with the deficit, because that would just kill jobs and depress growth and drive away investment, which is what happened between 2015 and 2019. We're doing the opposite. Our deficit reduction strategy is first and foremost an economic growth strategy. How do we grow the economy? By bringing more job-creating investment here. How do we bring more job-creating investment? In part, by reducing taxes on businesses to have a competitive advantage, the Alberta advantage, and reducing red tape, and all of the other policies we're doing to drive diversification and growth. So that's our obsession: growth, growth, growth. That will help to deal with the lion's share of the deficit through increased revenues, but on the other side, continued spending restraint. It doesn't have to be deep and dramatic, though. Janelle Melanchuk says, why is the education minister not truly taking feedback about the curriculum? School boards aren't piloting it because it is not a sound curriculum and needs to be revised, especially social studies. Well, thanks, Janelle. First of all, I respectfully disagree about your assessment on the curriculum, but I appreciate you sharing your view. In the last 10 or 12 years, we have seen a very troubling decline in math proficiency and numeracy amongst Alberta students as measured against kids across the world. And this is clearly tied to the widespread adoption of so-called discovery math in our school system. So we committed. We've also seen a decline, less severe, but a decline nevertheless in literacy and reading proficiency for elementary students in Alberta, while many jurisdictions around the world, especially in Asian countries, continue to outpace us. That does not bode well for the economic prospects of our kids in an increasingly globalized and digital economy. We need to catch up. And so that's why we ran on a commitment to consult broadly, including with parents, in developing a back to basics curriculum that would ensure we equip young people with the critical knowledge and skills to succeed in the future, particularly in core areas like numeracy and literacy. But we also committed to get politics out of the NDP's draft social studies curriculum and instead to focus on what I would call civic and cultural literacy, an understanding of our world, where we came from, the development of our own society, and all of those issues. I know there's been, look, I think there's two kinds of criticism about the curriculum. There are some that is just highly politicized, coming from special interest groups that supported the failure at Discovery Math, that want a politicized social studies curriculum, and that frankly I think have a lack of ambition for what kids can learn in terms of knowledge and knowledge-based curriculum. So I think some of that criticism is not reasonable or well-founded, but there is a lot of good constructive criticism out there, and I know that Minister LaGrange and the government broadly is very keen to take that on board. There will be, I anticipate, significant changes between the current draft and the final product, and Minister LaGrange is reaching out to superintendents and school boards and others. She'll have some announcements in the weeks to come about the next steps for engagement. But if you have strong views, please share those. There's a way to do so. Please go to the Department of Education's website. And constructive criticism, not highly politicized trash talk, but constructive criticism will be taken very seriously. We all want the same thing, which is an effective curriculum that prepares young people well for the future, that equips them with critical knowledge, and focuses in particular on better outcomes in numeracy and literacy. All right, Mark Riley says, Premier, will the decision on provincial police go to a referendum? I don't yet know, Mark. We have not made final decisions on that. I just reviewed this week a final version of the report that we have commissioned from PricewaterhouseCoopers. They did the big report on the City of Surrey decision to go with their own municipal police. A lot of interesting stuff. I am increasingly supportive of the idea. I must confess, a few years ago, I thought it was a kind of a distraction. But I think there is enormous potential for us to really strengthen community policing in rural Alberta and smaller communities that do not have their own municipal police services. I think rural Albertans deserve the same kind of local and community policing that urban Albertans do through their police forces, the Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, and other police services that operate in urban areas. So just stay tuned. Our cabinet and caucus, will be meeting to discuss this in the days to come. Greg Bates says, did you know, Mr. Premier, if you stayed open like South Dakota with no lockdowns and no mask mandates and kept everything open, you could have had a $15 billion surplus above your budget? Amazing, Greg. No, I didn't know that. Greg, here's a question. How did mask mandates in Alberta have an impact on our oil revenues going from $10 billion to $100 million? I don't think oil markets track mask policy in Alberta or South Dakota. Greg, last year we saw the largest contraction of the world economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and we saw the largest reduction in oil and prices on record ever. We went from, I think, $60 WTI oil prices in the last part of February of 2020 to prices that went as low as -$20, -$25. A $85 negative turnaround in the most important commodity benchmark for our provincial economy. We saw the global economy contract by around 15%. That had nothing to do with masks. That had to do with the interruption in global economic activity, of the lack of travel, of the lack of transportation. I mean, I don't know whether you were following what was happening around the world last year, Greg, but it was a global economic catastrophe that doubled up on Alberta because of the oil price collapse. At the height of our restrictions in March of last year, April of 2020, we had 85% of Alberta businesses unaffected by restrictions, representing 96% of our provincial gross domestic product, and if I'm not mistaken, about 92% of our workforce. So restrictions would have had some economic impact, but a tiny impact compared to the broader global economic downturn last year, collapse last year. And Greg, let me just point this out. It's true that South Dakota had no public health restrictions. But Greg, you've also got to accept this. Go and look it up. South Dakota, population of 830,000, I think, has had over 2,000 COVID-related deaths that they reported. Those aren't made-up numbers. Those are no South Dakota's numbers. So we have 5 times the population and have had the equivalent, roughly the equivalent number of deaths, 2,200 deaths. If you were to transpose South Dakota's per capita COVID-19 death rate to Alberta's population of 4.5 million, we would have had over 10,000 deaths as opposed to 2,200. So Greg, for those of you guys who's out there who say you should have just followed Governor Kristi Noem and had no restrictions, to be blunt, that's a pretty easy thing to say, unless you're talking to the thousands more families who would have lost loved ones. Greg, maybe you would be willing to defend to Albertans 8,000 additional COVID deaths. I would not. You know that for several months, South Dakota had to send emergency and ICU patients out to other states because their hospitals were completely overrun. They had to airlift sick people asphyxiating from COVID infections to hospitals in Minnesota. Do you think I could accept for a day having to ship our patients out of province or out of country to get coverage? We more than doubled our maximum ICU capacity to deal with all of this. But if we'd let COVID run wild like they did in South Dakota, we would have hit that maximum of 425 COVID patients in ICU. And the only way we could get to that capacity would be mass cancellations of surgeries. Greg, I don't know, do you know anybody in your life who is waiting for surgery? Because I do. And what do you think the impact on their health is? If we had let COVID completely fill up the ICUs, if we had to shut down operating rooms and to rededicate or transfer anesthesiologists, surgical nurses, respiratory therapists from performing surgeries to going into ICU wards to deal with COVID patients, it would have been a catastrophe in our healthcare system. So good for South Dakota, but not good for the huge increase in death that they experienced, 5 times greater than Alberta's COVID death rate. So I'm sorry to be a bit hard with you there, but I just want, Greg, I'm being told not to lean forward, sorry, because the mic is back there. Greg, I'm sorry to be a bit tough on you there, but I think that there are totally legitimate and valid arguments about the negative impact of public health restrictions. And I'm glad that we have had that debate in the province. I'm glad there's people like you been making the point that restrictions hurt people. But I just ask those of you who take that view to be balanced about this and also to be honest about the risk and costs in terms of human lives in the healthcare system. Those are the real world trade-offs and choices that we've had to make. So anyway, enough about that. I apologize if I went too long. Jinder Ginhard says, are you going to investigate possible graveyards on residential schools? Yes, Jinder. Thank you for the very good question. And what we learned from the Kamloops residential school 2 weeks ago was it's just devastating, I think, for everybody to imagine the parents whose children were confiscated from them and never to return. It's true that most of those kids passed away from common diseases like tuberculosis and and influenza in those days, but at a much, much higher death rate than was the case for children in the general population, partly because of often deplorable living circumstances. This is a terribly brutal stain on our country's history. So as soon as I learned about that, I asked our Minister of Indigenous Relations and Minister for Service Alberta, who oversees the vital statistics and archives, to work together to ensure that we are fulfilling, I think it's recommendation 72 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Call to Action 72, which calls on provinces to basically search their archives and their vital statistics for any evidence about the fate of children who may have passed away while at residential schools. And so they're doing that work, and Minister Wilson will be coming forward with an additional announcement about how Alberta will collaborate with First Nations and the federal government to research any other potential unmarked graves. Randy McMullen says, how do you see us getting the economy going? Thank you, Randy. Well, first of all, here's some good news. The economy is going. According to the Conference Board of Canada this week, Alberta is leading Canada in economic growth. They project a 7.2% expansion of our economy, our GDP this year. Today, the Alberta Treasury Branch's economists, they've got the lowest projection for Alberta growth this year, but they just upped their projection by a full point from 4 to 5.1%, I believe. Most major banks and think tanks project Alberta is leading the country in growth. And let me just share this with you. Commodity prices, very strong. Lumber, best year by far in Alberta history. And more investment moving from BC lumber's industry to Alberta because we're much more open for business. And I think they've been hurting their industry with regulations. And they are doing extremely well. Agriculture, second best year ever in terms of farm revenues last year. And we're off to another strong year with good weather, therefore projected good yields and strong prices. And just stay tuned, billions of dollars of investment that we will be announcing later this year in new agriculture processing, agri-food processing. We also announced last year a $840 million expansion of Alberta's irrigation infrastructure, massively to expand yields and better improve water management in southern Alberta. Film and television, best year ever in Alberta history. And we will be announcing formally in the near future the largest ever film or television production in Canadian history, a multi-year series that will be shot here in Alberta that will create thousands of jobs. Venture capital, that's the fuel for high tech and startups. Venture capital is at the highest year ever last year, and the first quarter of 2021 has already exceeded any year in our history in terms of NCAP investment. And we're supporting that, for example, through our $175 million recapitalization of the Alberta Enterprise Corporation, which is a fund of funds to help kickstart venture capital. Startups in the digital and tech sector are taking off. We are in the midst of a transformative moment in the digital and tech sectors in Alberta. Last week, I announced that a major global tech company, Emphasis, out of India, is locating their Canadian headquarters in Calgary, committing to a minimum of 1,000 high-paying jobs. 3 weeks ago, I announced that Infosys, another major global tech company, is setting up a minimum of 1,000 jobs in Calgary. We expect to see many more. And there are many more announcements like that to come. It's going to be a very exciting year. Oil and gas, $70 WTI, and going to $80 we expect in the next few months, meaning that those companies that got battered last year are repairing their balance sheets and will be reinvesting in job-creating activity. I could go on, but whether it's our traditional industries or industries that represent diversification, 2021 is going to be a banner year in the Alberta economy, setting us up for, again, I think, leading growth next year. So none of this is happening by accident. I believe much of this is fueled by, because we have been building the foundations of a jobs and growth policy the 1/3 reduction in business taxes, the 1/3 reduction in the red tape burden, the modernization of Alberta labor legislation, the incentives for diversification like in petrochemicals and the Innovation Employment Grant, the huge investments that we are making in infrastructure to make our economy more efficient, irrigation being one example, and so much more that we have done to unleash the private sector in this province, getting back past COVID. We've already recovered all of the jobs that were lost during COVID, and I just think we're set for an Alberta renaissance. So I'm very optimistic, as you can see. Mike Rogers says, are we Canadians going to sue the Biden administration for shutting down Keystone? Yes. That was his one-word answer. What else we got here? Tristan House? April Marie says, Mr. Kenney, the Texas governor signed a bill that makes it illegal for any business or government entity prohibiting them from asking anyone for a vaccination passport on their status. Do you plan on implementing anything like this? Yeah, April, I saw that, and a number of U.S. states, Florida, have done that as well. The answer is no, we're not passing a law, but we are not bringing in vaccine passports. We're very close to the end of COVID, effectively. We are 6 months into our vaccine program, and we have not brought in, nor have we facilitated anything like a vaccine passport, and nor will we, period, end of story. We're not bringing in a law, though, I got to tell you, because I'm a free enterprise person, and I don't want the government to interfere. If there's a business that has a reason why its people should be vaccinated, I don't think the government should micromanage that business. Now, having said that, I do think there's a privacy issue here. And unless there are really compelling reasons, I think no business can ask people to divulge private information about their health status. So we're very careful about protecting that privacy interest. So there will not be vaccine passports in Alberta. Now, one exception would be foreign countries. If you go and travel abroad in the next few months, you may very well have a foreign country require you to show proof of vaccination, and you can get that from the Alberta government if you want. Kelmet Holtz says, are we still getting our own chief firearms officer to maintain our rights in relations for firearms? Yes, Kelmet. Now, that announcement will be made in the next few weeks, but please understand that we don't get to opt out of the Criminal Code of Canada. It is the criminal law for the whole country. And so the Alberta Chief Firearms Officer will be legally obliged to enforce those, to ensure the enforcement of those federal laws. But our hope is that an Alberta Chief Firearms Officer will apply that law in a common sense way and will focus their enforcement efforts on criminal abuse of firearms as opposed to regulatory harassment of law-abiding firearms owners. Josh Nault says, if the economy is doing so well, then why are costs going up and up for everything in life? Well, the two are linked, Josh, actually. When the economy does well, very typically you see inflation. And we hope, I don't hope the inflation doesn't get carried away. This is one reason that governments need to get their fiscal house in order, because in the long run, continued sustained deficit spending can lead to inflation, and so we've got to watch that. But that's mainly a monetary policy responsibility of the federal government and the Bank of Canada. We don't really control that. All I can say is higher costs should result in labor inflation, wage inflation, to help people deal with price inflation. Tina Petal Place says, sorry if I mispronounced that, Pettit Place says, do you have any updates on electricity rates? I don't really, Tina. I am very concerned, though, about the transmission rates. In particular, we've inherited I would argue, an overbuild of transmission infrastructure from previous years, which we just, current ratepayers, all of us have to pay for. It's embedded in our system. I am hoping that we're seeing more and more investment in additional electricity production, which should bring down over time the price of electricity itself. And our Associate Minister for Gas and Electricity, Dale Nally, is doing a study on whether there are ways we can reduce some of these transmission costs. Some of the ideas include sort of amortizing them over a greater length of time. But all of this, it's a very complex area that's heavily regulated, but we're seeing if there's some way that we can abate these often outrageous transmission costs. Justin Daviduke says, what is going on with the Human Trafficking Task Force? Have you heard nothing? Have heard nothing since launched. Oh, yeah, thank you for remembering about that, Justin. So our action plan to combat human trafficking was, for me personally, a very important part of our 2019 election platform. And one aspect was appointing the Human Trafficking Task Force, being chaired by Paul Brandt. Paul's known as a country music star, but he actually has he's a former nurse, and he has a long background in working on this issue. It's his passion. And I've had a couple of briefings from them. They've given us a couple of interim reports, and I'll get an update on that because probably they're getting due for some kind of a set of public recommendations. Pam Lycan says, has the $90 a year fee to drive Highway 40 to Kananaskis country for a hike been passed? I guess I'm getting a bit confused about Highway 40, but in terms of the K Country Pass, the K Country Conservation Pass, we call it, that has come into effect. I think it was on the 1st of June. And the reason we had to do that is the number of visits to Kananaskis country have just exploded. We had over 5 million visits last year. We get more visits there than Banff National Park does. Banff obviously has a revenue stream through the visitor pass to help provide for the infrastructure and services. We've been having huge problems with just like garbage being dumped all over the place, left in the ditches, the roadsides, huge number of search and rescue calls, of conservation problems, of we're having to spend tens of millions of dollars on modernizing the infrastructure out there. We're investing. We're taking the first step towards renewal of the Canmore Nordic Centre, and a lot of other infrastructure. We're hiring more environment and parks conservation officers and wildlife officers out there better to maintain the park. So that costs money, and we're broke right now with a $16 billion deficit. So we needed the additional source of revenue. Every other major provincial park and all of the national parks in Canada require visitors to participate in paying for the conservation, and we think that's reasonable. Alan Cleary Brond says, wow, these are so pre-screened questions. Well, if they are, Alan, how come I just asked yours? If you got a substantive one, put it in there. These are real questions that are asked by people. You can, if you have insomnia tonight, you can watch the tape, watch all the questions I answered, and go and check them out. They're coming from real people. We assume these are accounts that we see. And the only instruction that our team has that select the questions is to get us a good cross-section of questions. So I'm sorry if it's not what you want to ask, Alan, but we're just trying to answer from questions coming from a variety of perspectives. David Dorward. Hello, David. Thanks for the $1.3 billion hydrogen announcement with Air Products. It is great news for Edmonton, David, and just stay tuned. There's a lot more good news to come. On the hydrogen front, carbon capture utilization and storage investments, and I hope on petrochemicals. I have spent a lot of my time in this job trying to land some major petchem investments. They would all be in the industrial heartland and areas of east of Edmonton. Unfortunately, the federal government has put a fly in the ointment with their plastics ban, which lists normal plastic products as toxins, and that has created some real friction with the petrochemical companies that produce plastics. We are working hard with 6 other provinces and the Chemical Association of Canada to solve the problem with the feds. If we can do that, just stay tuned for minimum 10 and possibly north of $20 billion of very exciting petrochemical announcements in the Edmonton area. Kelmet Holtz says, if our lumber industry has done so well, why is it so expensive for us Albertans to purchase these building products? Well, Kelvin, the reason they're doing well is because the prices are high. And companies make money at high prices. It's just how it rolls. And quite frankly, I think those prices are going to stay high for a while because the post-COVID world economic recovery will continue to drive huge demand for building materials. The single most important factor in lumber prices is U.S. new housing builds. And we anticipate, as we emerge from COVID, that housing starts are going to really skyrocket in the U.S. So that may not be good news. If you're hoping to build a deck or you're relying on lumber, prices are probably going to be high for a while. But if you want to take any consolation, it means there's more people working in the lumber industry in Alberta. Darren Quayle says, does Notley support the referendum on equalization? No, absolutely not. In fact, the NDP has always said that they don't want changes in equalization. They support the equalization formula. They've always been against this idea of the referendum. And they're against referendums in general. When we brought in the Referendum Act to the legislature last year, they called it undemocratic. What's up with that? The idea of letting every adult Albertan vote directly on important issues is, according to the New Democratic Party, undemocratic. You can't make it up. The irony is so thick. Next question, Justin Jacobson says, any plans for support on skilled trades, example, grants, employment programs? If the economy grows as it should, we may be in a shortage. You're right about that, Justin. So yes, the answer is yes. About 3 weeks ago, we announced the Jobs Now program, which is a jobs training grant, and it is we are providing a 25% subsidy to businesses who agree to hire and help train a worker for at least 12 months. So we want that worker. We don't want these short-term training programs that are not connected to the labor market and to demand in the labor force. We want to ensure that companies have skin in the game, and so they have to put up 75% of the unit training costs. Let's say getting a young Albertan, putting them through a program at SAIT or NAIT, and if the company puts up 3/4 of the cost, we'll put up the other quarter. There's been huge demand for the program. It's really good news. We've also, I think, quadrupled funding for the high school registered apprenticeship program. And we have changed the funding formula for our colleges and universities to incentivize them to get better job outcomes from their graduates. And basically that's a nudge to the universities, especially because our polytechnics already do a great job, but it's a nudge to the universities to make their, in their budgeting, focus on programs that actually have labor market demand and lead to good employment levels. But you're absolutely right. You are, Justin, you're skating to where the puck is. I suspect that this time next year, one of the biggest problems in the Alberta economy will be labor and skill shortages. Please God, that would be a very good problem to have, but I think the growth is going to be so strong we'll see that. Already the tech sector and many in the hospitality sector that have been impaired through COVID are complaining about that. So that's definitely a challenge we'll have to face. Andy Thiesenhausen says, how about nuclear instead of crazy expensive wind and solar micro producers? Thank you, Andy. 2 thumbs up. We're not going to, if there's people that want to risk their money to invest in wind and solar, they're welcome to do so. We've stopped all subsidies for that. All subsidies have been ended. Nuclear, I am and always have been completely pro-nuke. The hypocrisy of the environmental special interest groups is best proven by their ideological opposition to nuclear power. Nuclear power is, of course, the lowest emitting source of power production. So why do the groups who claim that emissions are cooking the planet oppose nuclear power? Because they're opposed to even basic technology. Many of them, Greta, the Swedish young lady Greta, they want to shut down explicitly the modern industrial economy. I couldn't disagree more, and that's why Alberta last month signed a memorandum of understanding with the provinces of Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick to collaborate on the development of small modular reactor technology. One of the reasons we've seen so little new nuclear build in the past 30 years is just the scale of conventional large nuclear power plants is so enormous. You're talking $15-20 billion plus in capital risk. And the maintenance costs are just enormous as well. Just ask Ontario Power Generation. So now the difference, SMR, small modular reactor technology, is a game changer because it is so scalable. In principle, we'll be able in the future to have SMR reactors metaphorically, the size of a suitcase to help power, one factory. Or one small, you could have a small reactor to power one small community, or mid-size, a slightly larger reactor to power a major industrial project like perhaps an oil sands plant, an oil sands field. So you can do it in a much more decentralized way. It's much more capital efficient. And so I really believe that as the oil sands operators move towards their aspirational target of net zero production of oil by 2050, that small modular reactors may be part of that story. So we will do everything we can to facilitate it. John Kirby says, will fans be able to return to CFL games this season? You haven't announced anything, yes. The answer is yes, John. We have announced it. We announced opening for summer, opening for good. When we get to phase 3, that will be in about 3 weeks' time. And at that point, CFL games, have at her. So I think the CFL has made a tentative announcement about exhibition games starting in August, if I'm not mistaken. But absolutely, Commonwealth Stadium and McMahon Stadium will be open, unlimited capacity for I was about to say Eskimos, for Edmonton Elks and Calgary Stampeders games. Mike Puck says, Premier Kenney, are you going to the Stampede this year? 100%. You couldn't keep me away with a team of horses. I am looking forward to getting together with fellow Albertans to enjoy our open summer. I'll break the announcement here. We will be hosting the traditional annual Premier's Stampede breakfast as normal on the Monday of Stampede downtown. And I've been working very hard this week to get the federal government to sign off on a national interest exemption to allow the American and other foreign rodeo athletes to come north to participate in the rodeo here. It's been a bit of a challenge. I won't go into details, but we've been working with the Stampede and the federal government, and hopefully by the time I'm done this show, the letter should have shown up so we can give the Stampede the full thumbs up on the rodeo. Adita Kurz says, if the province lifts mask mandates, can the Calgary mayor still mandate us to wear them? Well, Adita, I don't think there's anything in the law prohibiting that, but I would certainly hope and expect that mayors and municipal councils will respect the expert opinion and the advice of the chief medical officer and Alberta's public health officials. There is no jurisdiction in the world that has, at a level of 70% population protection, maintained a mask mandate. Especially for outdoors events. There is no science to support that, and I'm sure Calgarians will make that point. Jay's Miracle says, hello, Premier, when can Albertans expect to start seeing SMRs in Alberta? I think I just answered. Well, that's a follow-up question. The projection would be by about 2032, so about a decade from now, that we could start to see the operation of small modular reactors here. I'm going to keep rolling here. I've answered 30 questions, but give me a couple more here. To our team, please. Brock Bench says, Premier, I was very happy with the recent hydrogen announcement. The world really is moving to green energy, and there is so much opportunity. I know we can't turn our back on traditional oil and gas overnight, But what do you think of making Alberta a world leader in green energy? Well, Brock, I certainly believe that we will be a world leader in hydrogen, which is one aspect of green energy. I wouldn't get so hung up on this, on the nomenclature, though, because most of the hydrogen projects here will be blue hydrogen, which can actually, and in many cases are, lower emitting than so-called green energy. And in terms of renewable electricity production, we're for that as long as it's on a market basis. And since our government ended the NDP carbon tax and the subsidies that came from that to wind and solar, so since we wrapped up those subsidies and confirmed a energy-only market, we've actually seen a huge increase in investments in wind and solar, and Alberta is leading Canada right now on wind and solar energy development. So a lot of interesting things happening out there, but there will be, believe me, there will be a significant future for conventional oil and gas for a very good time, a long time to come, and we should be there to meet that global demand so we don't end up surrendering energy markets to the world's worst regimes. Darcy Kerr says, with hydrogen, will there be some technical training programs and help for us in the energy sector to get back to work in this exciting new source of energy? Yes, absolutely, Darcy. And there's a lot of overlap here, right? The oil sands producers yesterday announced their collaboration on achieving a net zero target for 2050. A lot of that will involve hydrogen. A lot of it will involve big investments in carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And I think those are going to be great sectors for traditional energy workers to be in. But I'm determined to make sure there's also a great future for energy workers. Here's some cool news, Darcy. There are more people working in oil and gas today than there were a year ago, than there were pre-COVID. So we're actually seeing a real recovery in the labor force in oil and gas. Robert Zaleschuk says, do you still support construction of the Green Line? Yes, sorry. I've just got spring allergies catching up with me here. The answer is yes, Robert. In principle, we've just had to work through our due diligence. Like, what responsible government would stroke a $1.5 billion check, no questions asked, on a huge and complex project where there could be many serious risks? So we brought in some leading engineering experts to help advise us on those risks and to work out with the city of Calgary a plan to mitigate those risks. A lot of this stuff involving tunneling, going through downtown. We don't want to end up writing checks for a white elephant kind of project. So we've got to be very careful about our due diligence, but I think we're getting close to a final agreement. Amanda Francis says, what does the new school year look like for the students and staff? It looks like normal, Amanda. Schools will be coming back end of August, beginning of September, and no masks, no social distancing required for the kids, just back to normal. I think everybody will have learned some better personal hygiene practices, more frequent washing of hands, staying at home if we're sick, and things like that. And that's all very good. But Amanda, Alberta went faster in vaccinating school-aged kids than any other province. So we allowed 12 and up to start getting vaccinated a few weeks back, which means that half of our kids between 12 and 18 in school are vaccinated. So we're ahead of the other provinces. We'll be opening up. Because my allergies are getting the better of me, I'm going to have to wrap. We've been at this for an hour, 20 minutes, taken 34 questions. I'll take one more in just a second. I did a news conference today. I think I did one yesterday, one the day before. I'm doing another news conference tomorrow. And did a Q&A with the Alberta Enterprise Group earlier today. We're going to put that up on YouTube and Facebook, by the way. So just want you to know I'm out here trying to answer questions and be accountable. Thank you very much for all the great questions. The last question goes to Tina Petitplace, who says, full rodeo including the Chucks, ? Unfortunately not, Tina. The Chucks are a different event from the rodeo. the Stampede has announced there won't be chuck wagons this year simply because the chuck wagon organizers, the circuit, just weren't ready to roll. Usually they start in the spring. I think it takes them kind of months to get their teams trained up, but their horses in place, all of the logistics. It's a pretty big deal. And the Stampede says that unfortunately the chuck wagon teams just weren't going to be ready to roll out this July, which is unfortunate. But the Stampede is planning a kind of expanded grandstand show that will integrate some rodeo elements. So it's still going to be the greatest outdoor show on earth. You know, some people on Twitter, the usual suspects, have mocked me for talking about the best summer ever. Folks, you know, I think you know what I mean by that, which is a summer past the pandemic with no health restrictions, where grandparents can hug their grandchildren, where friends can gather with their neighbors for barbecues, where all of our social connections can be reestablished. That, for I think many of us, those simple things is going to make it the greatest summer. But we're also set for an amazing economic recovery, which I think is going to give that real meaning. So it's been tough, 16 months, but we are resilient and we are by nature optimists. I hope you're starting to feel a bit of that optimism. If you haven't got vaccinated yet and you're open to it, please do so. Do so this week so we can speed up the full opening and encourage other folks to do the same. God bless you. Thank you very much for your great questions. Talk to you guys later.